Chapter 1. I was so foolish. I was so young. But there was gold in my hands. I found it wedged in between the jagged rocks in the pouring rain. It wasn't silver. It wasn't copper or iron pyrite. It was gold. It was goddamn gold. I remembered its shine. It felt smooth like silk. It glistened and sung. I rushed back to the men. The rain slammed off my armor, but through it, I saw the fires of the other side, the Inca side. Their fires were strong and bright, and they whipped in the wind. It took me another 2 hours to reach back to camp, and in those 2 hours, I thought of all the time I had spent in the jungle. When I arrived back at camp, I approached my superiors, the men I looked up to all this time, the brothers Bizarro, Hernando, Juan, Gonzalo, and old Francisco. Then I made my way to Almagro and his son Diego. Then finally, I met Soto, my dear old friend. I stared at their weather-beaten, dirty, desperate faces, and they stared at mine. I shook their hands and answered their questions. "How far down the path did you go, Sardina?" 2 miles. "Did you see a river?" "Yes." "How large?" "Not large." "What else did you see, Sardina?" "The fires." "The fires?" "Yes." "How far do you think they are?" The rest of the scouts looked at me with great disdain that day, but I didn't care, because finally, the proof we needed was in my hands. And as Francisco approached me, he stood and sighed. But instead of a speech, he merely gave me a smile. It was a demented, familiar smile. It was pure and demonic, and I knew it well. During the night, I peered out into the distance. I saw the Inca fires from the other side of the hill. For hours, I watched the smoke build and tumble. The Incas were well within reach now. We could smell each other. Had we known how impossible it was, had we known the hard and true facts, I do not believe we would have gone as far as we did. Had we known just how impossible and arduous a task that was before us, we might not have left Spain. But history continued. And for the time being, we remained content to be foolish, ignorant, and hungry. And as I drifted on to sleep, I remembered Soto's words. The reason, the only reason we came this far. Dreams, Sardina. The land ahead was Peru, the city, Carimaca, and its people, the Incas. It was an empire of millions, and their king, Atahualpa, was a man who marveled at the very thought of war. Throughout his life, Atahualpa's broad shoulders and massive legs trekked every square of his beloved land. And on nights where he saw the stars dip out from the horizon, sensed the grandness of the peaks of the Andes, the lush beauties of the jungles of Vilcabamba, and the wonder that was Cusco, he would sigh and say to himself that it was all worth fighting for, and again if necessary. His brother Manco joined him later that day, the day before Apachacute, and in the evening they walked along the base of the mountain to meet the shaman. They ate berries and overripe aguajes, and Atahualpa gazed over the sacred hills. Manco, on the other hand, looked quite disturbed. He saw gray clouds emerge from Machu Picchu and thought horrible, endless thoughts. He had spoken with the shaman a week prior and was informed of the bad news. He repeated the conversation in his mind and tried to relay it to Atahualpa, but he failed to gain his interest. Word for word came back to Manco. It came in dreams and visions, and it haunted him for days. Apachacute. The world turned upside down. But still, Atahualpa gave it little thought. They waited beyond a yellow brook as a storm rumbled upon the land. Soon rain poured onto the valley, and the temple walls were spewed with mud. As the rain subsided, Atahualpa and Manco waited for an hour. They rested on rocks and gave in to the tranquil rhythm of the stream. Yet another hour elapsed, but there was no sign of the shaman. The clouds turned black, and the storm raged beyond the Andes. But still, the shaman did not show. Later, they were met by Waman Poma, Atahualpa's friend and prime advisor. He too shared the terrible dream that Manco had dreamt. Waman Poma told Atahualpa that he had dreamt of evil spirits. He dreamt of ghosts riding strange beasts. He dreamt that the sun had disappeared and that the air was permeated by a devastating hum, a hum not of this natural world. And he dreamt that their Inca gods had died in an endless fog. But again, Atahualpa wanted to hear none of it. The next day, Waman Poma joined Manco and Atahualpa on the mountain summit, and there they finally met the shaman. They gathered and prayed to Riaquacha, their god of ice. Later, a ceremony commenced, and the ayahuasca was brewed. The shaman rattled his stick in the silver starlight. He sang and repeated the sacred Ikiros, and all fell into rhythm. Then, all fell into the void. They dreamt together and saw their ancestors travel amongst the high amber flames of the fire. Inside the flame, they received their warnings, and their language went on without words. The vision began, and indeed, it was the same vision both Waman Poma and Manco had dreamt. Apachacute. The world turned upside down. The land they loved disappeared, and their spirits vanquished. Then all went black, then gray. The light returned, and black dragons swallowed the trees. Then the Incas vomited and felt their skulls rot from inside, and all went black again. The next day, the shaman disappeared. Manco and Waman Poma fretted and watched their steps very carefully. They set out the scouts to patrol the limits of Carimaca. Then they set up another meeting with Atahualpa to discuss further matters. But, to their surprise, Atahualpa was nowhere to be found. An hour later, they found Atahualpa by the stream. He was with his children. Manco and Waman Poma stepped forward. Atahualpa nodded and turned to Manco. "Did you send the scouts?" "All of them," said Manco. "Good," said Atahualpa. "They haven't returned," said Manco. "They'll return," said Atahualpa. "Manco, you're trembling. What is it?" "These spirits." "What about them?" They're what, Manco?" Manco sighed and forcefully closed his eyes, hoping he was still dreaming. He wasn't. Atahualpa returned the sigh and patted Manco on his shoulder. "They'll come on their own time. Now's not the time to worry. Now's the time to eat." So they ate and dined together, like they always did on late summer nights. and the whole royal family was together once again. Few knew it would be the last time. Even fewer knew the hell that was in store for them. Because an hour later, Wamampoma had found the Spanish fires. He smelled their scents and heard their voices, and as he hastened back to Carimaca to inform Atahualpa, he lost his breath, trembled, and collapsed to the ground. When he got up, his hands were still trembling. For the nightmare had morphed into reality, and the fear embedded in the facts. The fear was present. The fear was now. The Spanish had arrived. Carimaca was only a day away, but in that time, I found myself dreadfully lost in thought. I thought about the jungle and the days we trekked the snows and slopes of the mountains. But what I thought about most was the day Francisco drew his line in the sand. I stared into Francisco's eyes for the longest time that day. I swirled in his eyes and was enraptured by his impossible symphony, and I simply could not let go. I didn't know if it was a guiding light or the angel of desolation, but I knew one thing: he was still our leader. I saw the rage settle in his mind. I felt his words. His words were righteous and absurd, but they made perfect sense to me. Francisco, poor Francisco, the man who lost it all. In all, 12 men crossed the line and joined Francisco that day in Panama, and I was one of them. I joined Francisco and ventured deeper into hell, and the jungle took my soul. It was a very easy decision. In my mind, going back to Spain meant I had failed. I couldn't imagine returning to Spain as a broken man, with only a sad story no one wanted to hear. I remembered looking back at the men who boarded the rescue ship. They all looked dead inside. Relieved, but still dead. No. If I were to return to Spain, I wanted to come back as the victor, not as the pauper, not as poor as my father. Since that day on the beach, 2 years had passed, and in those 2 years we headed down the coast to the great land of the South and searched for that illustrious city. We were to be the kings we longed to be as boys. We were to find the cities in speech and live as God intended. Rulers of a rich and prosperous land, rulers of the great cities of gold. But it never happened. Not until that day. Not until Carimaca. Hours had passed, and more thoughts crept into my mind. Then I remembered the last confession I had made. It might have only been a year ago. I couldn't remember, but I remembered the words and how I said them to Father Rodriguez. In truth, confession was the last thing on my mind. I was hesitant to tell him anything, but for some reason, I trusted him. I told him my sins. I told him every one, but I did so only because I felt pity for him. And a simple fact remained. Father Rodriguez was the loneliest man I had ever met. He simply needed the company. Was it lust, Sardina? Lust, Father. Yes, it was. Lust of all things. Lust of women to begin with. The native women who I saw in between the skirmishes were naked as the day they were born, but they were beautiful. Their breasts were supple, and their eyes were inviting. And as we reached Panama, the women greeted us as gods, and gods we were. Those I wanted, I took. Those who ran, I chased. I chased until I got, and when I got, I devoured. The want was all I had, and it was tremendous. Are women the only thing you lusted for? No. What else, Sardina? Blood. 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 The blood from the natives and everyone I had killed, every bone I had pierced through, and every face that suddenly went cold. Thou shalt not kill, within reason. Was it wrong? I couldn't tell anymore. But blood was only proxy to the real lust that brought me here. And as my confession continued, my earliest memories swirled in my mind. I thought of Cortez returning to Spain. That day might have been the happiest day in all of my life. I remember the parade going on for hours and hours, and how astonishing it was for me. For it showed me what could be done, and what men were capable of doing. And there they were, men amongst men, men of honor, our heroes, the conquerors, the conquistadors. How I cheered and roared, how I longed and wanted. And you worshipped them? I did. But I didn't tell him everything. I couldn't tell him that my God was replaced a long time ago. I couldn't tell him that I worshipped not just the conquistadors, but a new God. A God who just glimmered. My God became gold. I held it sacred, and each day I prayed to it. And like a true believer, I adored and sung its praises. Those are quite horrible things, my son. I know, Father. The memory died, and I was glad. During the evening, I saw the Pizarros huddled near a fire and studied them from a distance as they drew sticks in the sand. First was Hernando, the reasonable, compassionate, and the second eldest brother. Then there was Gonzalo, the shortest of all the brothers and the cruelest. And lastly, there was Juan. Juan might have been the smartest of all the Pizarros. God knows what he would have been if he had remained in Spain. But what all the brothers had in common was their allegiance to their elder sibling, Francisco. And the dominant emotion they all shared was fear. I guess certain things never change. As the night progressed, Francisco talked with his brothers soberly and had answered all their questions. Then he drank a jug of wine and told them the truth. I watched him hold up that nugget of gold that I had found. He passed it to each of his brothers, and they took turns examining it underneath the dim light of the fire. And although the nugget was coarse and rough along its edges, it glimmered and sparkled. And that was all that mattered. But deep down inside, I knew without the Almagros, we would not have gotten this far. Most of the horses were theirs, not to mention all the cannons and crossbows. But the Almagros and Pizarros shared one common thread. Both families were terrible gamblers. It was quite a gamble on both sides to trust each other as long as they did, but in their minds, the gamble was worth it. And on the day we reached Catimaca, I understood it in whole. Towards the end of the night, Soto and I discussed the rumors that we were closer to the city than we realized. Yet, even if these rumors were true, I couldn't move as fast as Soto thought, and I was amazed at his fluidity. I held a black pawn in my hand, and Soto gave me a cold stare. For nearly a year, Soto had taught me how to play the game. I was horrible at it, but each night, there was another opportunity to learn. He set up the board and aligned the pieces. It looked crowded and confusing as always. I thought about the first night Soto taught me how to play. I thought about the rules and the pieces, the armies, the bishops, the knights, the two opposing worthless kings, and the all-powerful queen who could move any way she wanted. And again, Soto's voice drifted into my reverie. Don't forget about pawns, Sardina. They may seem worthless, but they're priceless when you need them. Which is all the time. Soto was different, that was certain. He knew the rules in both chess and life. He wasn't a king, nor was he as predictable as a bishop or rook. He was indeed a knight. He moved in his own mysterious accord. Each night, I had gotten better, but each night, I had lost. In my days with Balboa, I remember Soto playing the game. He played with such ease that it seemed as if he were bored. There were moments where I felt as if he had invented the game, and those moments were common. He never let me win, but he showed me what I was doing wrong. And although I truly didn't comprehend everything, Soto would always comfort me with words of encouragement. Every time you play, you learn something new. Then I asked him how long he played the game. All my life, he said. We trekked south and finally received word of the tribe. The guides called them the Incas. We were less than 100 men and 30 horses, and as we went further down, I heard Francisco shout and bicker on with Almagro as they rode beside each other. The land got steeper. In the coolness of the mountain ice, and beyond the sharp and deep trenches of snow and rock, I saw the valleys below. Their green slopes spread far and wide. Even in the fog, they looked majestic. But all those views came briefly. An hour later, we reached the jungle's interior. Soon the heat grew unbearable. Snakes fell down from trees and dropped onto our armor, and we slashed away at them and pressed forward. When we got to the pass, we crossed a stretch of black rocks and found a slough of scattered skulls. There seemed to be 1,000 of them. The translator said that we had entered into a grave of an unsuccessful tribe who were at constant war with the Inca. And this was what was left of them. There were old skulls and new ones. Some were shaded yellow. Some looked faded and solemn. Other skulls looked fresh. Then at midday, we reached the base of the mountain and saw another horrendous sight. It was our warm welcoming, as Soto suggested. The guards pointed. I looked and saw a line of 12 heads stacked on wooden palisades that seemed to go on for a quarter of a mile. Another minute later, I spotted the guides conversing with one another. Then the friars interrupted them and asked again. The translations went on and on. Then the guides brought back specimens, and we held them in our hands. They were little chunks of amber stone, gold. How much there was anyone's guess. Word spread, and the men shouted. And we forged deeper into hell. The Spanish were 2 miles from Carimaca. The guides pointed where the jungle ended and the city limits began. As night fell, they saw the bright firelights of the city flicker beneath the stars. Juan Poma returned to the canopy and saw the Spanish fires emerge. The night passed. The smoke from either side flooded the sky. No one slept. Those who did only pretended. Atahualpa and Manco, Sardina and Soto, the Pizarros, the Almagros, and all the rest. They were all there. They were all drunk with fear. So what in heaven's name could they do, besides tremble and quake, and fret, and deny? All would have to wait until morning. They called the city Carimaca, and in the morning we found it. It was smaller than what we expected, but it was certainly a city, and it was something to behold. There was a grand square with stones gathered about, and a high temple with steep steps on either side. We found fresh fires still smoldering in the heat of the day. And later we searched for the gold that we all knew they were hiding. When the morning came, we patrolled the city's limits. We lined up in staggered formation, and the bowmen did the same. The Incas did not show for quite a while. They tested us and assumed that we would retreat. But we were too obstinate and clearly too stupid to fall into their trap. Playing chess with Soto taught me many things, but what it taught me the most was that the most dangerous times for men to be in were the times in between the moves. Most games ended right then and there, and this one was no exception. At sundown, we finally saw the Incas pour onto the square. Then he made his entrance. Atahualpa, the Inca king. He was dressed in beautiful plumage and resembled a giant, proud bird. He wore an enormous black and gold cloak made from bat skins, and he took his seat on his golden throne. We all stared at Atahualpa, but not directly. We stared at his golden throne. It seemed too unreal. I myself stared at Atahualpa's golden necklace that went all the way down to his knees, and I tried my best to wipe away the sweat from my palms. The translators went on, and the formalities proceeded, and Francisco approached first. The two giants, Pizarro, tall and thin and gray and bearded, and Atahualpa, thick, red, and royal. Each word that wasn't said was a prayer to save their souls. More Incas crowded the square. Then Atahualpa rose up from his throne and made his speech. Atahualpa spoke proudly, but only certain phrases stood out. A sacred land, his people and his ancestors of 1,000 years before. It was all very brief. After the speech, 100 more Incas gathered and aligned themselves in defensive formation. In a matter of seconds, we were outnumbered. And soon 1,000 more Incas poured into the square, surrounding the center and perimeter. We squirmed and we shook, but we stood our ground. Then Francisco took the stage. He made a magical speech, but I forgot every word. All I remembered were his hands commanding Atahualpa to show us his gold. But Atahualpa just stared at him and remained silent. Then the priest Valverde approached with the Holy Bible in his right hand and a cross in his left. He made a speech about Christ and the Pope and some gibberish about wine and water. He sweated profusely, and his heavy brown robes were drenched. He continued his speech, yet no one on either side listened to a single word. Atahualpa drew a deep breath and yawned as loud as he could. Then the friar stopped, and a hush followed. Atahualpa broke the silence and growled. He clutched his stomach and asked his servants for some fruit. The servants returned with a ripe papaya, and Atahualpa inhaled it in one gulp. He slurped and smacked and devoured, and we watched the juices run down from his mouth. Then he said we were welcome to stay the evening, and to our amazement, Francisco accepted the offer. Afterwards, Atahualpa departed. The other Incas soon followed, and we waited in the square until the next morning. The sun died. The night came. No one slept. No one could. We kept at our sides, watching, waiting, pondering our next move. The sun returned, and by mid-morning the Incas again drew into the square, and the events of the previous day were repeated. They surrounded us. Every single Inca carried a spear. They moved in closer. We stood our ground. Then Francisco took the stage once more. With soft eyes and a cordial smile, Francisco spoke his demands. The translators tried in careful haste to make every word sound lighter, yet Atahualpa gave no reply. Francisco asked again and raised his voice louder, but Atahualpa simply stared. Then Valverde made another speech. It was the same speech he had given the day before. And when it was over, Atahualpa grabbed the Bible from Valverde's grubby hands and shoved him to the ground. Then Atahualpa made a speech of his own. When he finished, Atahualpa put the Bible to his face and sniffed it. Then he repeated a phrase, which he later screamed. He looked to Valverde, then to Francisco. Why does this say nothing to me? He looked back to his people, then turned back to us. His people cheered on, and we gripped our swords. Then Atahualpa shouted and repeated, Why does this say nothing to me? His people cheered louder, and Valverde groveled. Then Atahualpa gave us all a vile stare, and he threw the Bible to the ground. And from there, I can only remember the grin Francisco had given him. He was waiting for that moment all of his life, and all I remembered next was the blood. The Spanish opened fire. All of Carimaca exploded into chaos, but the Incas fought back. They suffocated the Spanish simply by outnumbering them in close hand-to-hand combat. They struck the Spanish with spears and clubs and sticks and fans. And after several minutes of this, Atahualpa and his Incas sensed a quick victory. Then, it all changed. The Spanish regrouped. They found clear open spaces and fired back with their crossbows. As time wore on, the Spanish gained more ground and had cut their way forward. The horsemen encircled the square and trampled over the Incas. Then the cannons and arquebuses fired in unison. Shards of shrapnel pierced through Inca flesh, and plumes of smoke fogged the entire area. And an hour later, it was certain that the swing of momentum would never return. In the rain, the Spanish unleashed their dogs. They plunged their Toledo swords into the Incas, and the slaughter continued throughout the morning. Soon the crowds of Incas cleared and dispersed into lesser and lesser sections, and the Spanish opened fire, picking them off one by one. Atahualpa himself fought with great courage, He peered over to Manco and found him standing and attacking with a spear in his hand and a Spanish shield in the other. But the Spanish kept coming, and freshly decapitated heads of the Incas kept rolling. Blood spilled onto the marble and onto the steps of the temple in the square. Then the rain fell and blended with the suffocated smoke as shots continued to fire from all directions. And the Spanish cut and slashed and pierced and sliced. Atahualpa led another charge and was backed by 100 of his men. But the charge was short-lived. They ran straight into crossbows, and the Spanish infantry flanked them on either side of the temple walls. Soon Atahualpa's 100 warriors dwindled to a dozen, then to a half-dozen. And as Atahualpa turned away, he was struck in the head by fallen shrapnel. A voice cried out, "Alive! Alive! I want him alive!" Atahualpa fell to the ground, and 2 Spanish soldiers quickly quarantined him away from the battle. Francisco approached him with seething teeth and a demented grin. He bent over to Atahualpa's body, and with his palm, Francisco raised Atahualpa by his chin and wiped away the sand from his lips. Then he gave the signal, and the 2 men latched Atahualpa into chains and escorted him away. Half an hour passed. Much remained the same. The bodies of dead Inca warriors piled up in stacks. Hundreds became thousands, and the bodies kept piling. Manco and the other Incas continued to defend the temples, but after another 20 minutes, it was clear that the battle was over. Manco searched for his men. Through the fog, he saw warrior after warrior fall down in the rain. He saw the women and children dash out of the city. Then he saw more of his people flee into the jungles of Vilcabamba. And with great reluctance, Manco joined them and disappeared through the canopy. The rain finally stopped, and the sky swirled in gray ash and soot. The last Inca warrior had surrendered, and the dogs drove him to the ground and ripped away at his flesh. And as the last cannon fired, Atahualpa opened his eyes. He saw the iron chains strapped to his hands. He bled from his forehead and watched his Catemaca burn throughout the night. And in the morning, the Pizarro brothers looked at their captured Atahualpa, and they smiled through their grimaces.